Hi everyone. For the last couple of weeks, we have learned about Western Europe as well as Eastern Europe and the development of the two different branches of Christianity in those areas. And we've also discussed the Middle East and the development of Islam. And for this particular lecture, we're going to look at the clash between these two areas that results in the Crusades, and we will also talk about the aftermath of the Crusades and the creation of the major gunpowder empires. The time period that we're going to be discussing is between the 11th and the 16th century, and much of what we will talk about, especially the impact of the Crusades, will set us up for discussing the Age of Exploration next week. The assignment that you all are going to do in conjunction with this week's lecture is a little bit different than the usual. You will still have a short discussion board that you'll be responsible for, as there are a couple of articles and one short video clip that I would like you all to read or watch about anti-Muslim discrimination post 9/11, as well as about Islamophobia in the United States. But the bigger assignment is that in place of taking a regular quiz, you all are going to have to do an essay on the Crusades, and this is an essay topic that was actually chosen by the department, and your classes have been selected to take part in this essay assignment. I think that you shouldn't have too much of a problem doing it because I have actually set up the lecture in such a way that we answer the prompt in the exact order that it's asked. And the prompt is listed here. It says, what were the motivations for the Crusades? Why did thousands of Europeans commit themselves to a war against Islam to retake the Holy Land around Jerusalem? In what ways have the legacies of the Crusades or the historical interpretations of that period come to inform the opinions of people in both the West and the Middle East? And you are going to write a 2-page double-spaced paper answering this prompt. And when I say 2 pages, I mean 2 full pages all the way down to the bottom of the second page. You don't need to use citations. However, I ask that you only use this particular lecture, the discussion board resources that I provide for you, and if you need to, your chapter of your textbook. Be very careful with copying and pasting from this lecture or from your textbook, as that would be considered plagiarism. So while I know which sources you got your material from, I want to see it written in your own words. And this is a pretty important assignment. The department will use it to gauge how much students have learned over the semester. And there is a rubric we'll be using to grade this, which I'll put up on Moodle for you all so that you can see a little bit about what you should focus on and what you should be concerned with as you write the essay. And it measures things like your thesis statement and whether or not you have a good argumentative essay that's backed up with facts, your mechanics and your grammar and your spelling. So it's the usual things you would expect to go along with writing an essay. Before we really delve into the story of the Crusades, I just want to quickly do a review about Europe and the Middle East in the Middle Ages. And at this point, you all have actually spent 2 weeks learning about Europe in the Middle Ages. First, you learned about the Dark Ages, which applied to Western Europe, and then you learned about the Byzantine Empire, which is Eastern Europe. And if you compare the two, they're extremely different. The Byzantine Empire was much more cosmopolitan, and most people lived in large cities like Constantinople. In Western Europe, it was actually very rural, and it was ordered by a system of feudalism, which is also called manorialism. And if you remember, it was essentially a system with the king at the top and peasants at the bottom, and in the middle you have nobility and knights. And in exchange for giving land, each person on this rung would receive something, whether that was shelter and food or protection. And this is what structured a society that would otherwise possibly have fallen into chaos. You'll find that in Western Europe, they were extremely poor. There were not many vestiges of the Roman Empire. They fell apart after the fall of the Roman Empire. There were very high illiteracy rates. There were high death rates due to food shortages as well as to disease. In comparison, there was extreme wealth in the Byzantine Empire. There were a lot of vestiges of the Roman Empire. For example, the roads still remained. There was a strong infrastructure in the form of a large army and navy. The taxation system still existed. The church system. There was a system of weights and measurements, and there was one currency called the bezant. In Western Europe, they had no currency because they actually practiced the bartering method. Now, if you compare the political system of the two, they're also very different. The Byzantine Empire is a system known as Caesaropapism. And if you break down that word, which seems quite large, Caesar would be a ruler, and papism, we know, would be something about the church. And so it tells us that the ruler was the head of both the government as well as the church. They were a patriarch who was said to be the peer of the apostles. They ruled with the consent of God. In comparison, Western Europe went through several different stages. Initially, they start out as a series of warring kinship-based clans, and they were often fighting over vendettas and feuds, and they eventually transitioned into a series of warring regional kingdoms like the Vandals and the Goths and the Visigoths. And if you've ever seen Braveheart, this is actually the time period right around this that film is portraying. And then the last and maybe the most important political system they emerge into is the Holy Roman Empire. And this begins in 800 when the Pope actually places Emperor Charlemagne of the Carolingian line onto the throne, and they attempt to take this fragmented Western Europe and pull it back together and find some unity like you would have found in ancient Rome and also like you found in the Byzantine Empire. The other really important thing you all have learned is that the Great Schism of 1054 made this fracturing in Christianity so that on the one side, the Byzantines became Eastern Orthodox and they're associated with speaking Greek, and on the other side, in the Holy Roman Empire, they became Roman Catholic, and they were associated with speaking Latin. And there were several different reasons for the Great Schism that you all learned about, but this is going to become important in understanding the religious history behind the people who are fighting in the Crusades. In addition to learning a great deal about the worlds of European Christendom, you also read a chapter about the Islamic world, and it started off talking about the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula and how many of the people were pagans. There was a small minority who were Jews or Christians, but most believed that their pagan gods were housed in the Kaaba. They lived in a clan-structured society where kinship was important, and you followed one of three trades. You were either a farmer, a Bedouin, or a trader. And the birth of Muhammad really changes everything in that he says that he receives a series of revelations telling him to actually fix what he considers to be a broken religion, and that would be of Judaism as well as Christianity. And originally he's not trying to create a new faith, but to reform the faiths that already exist. Now, he originally has quite a good relationship with the Jewish community, but it eventually splinters when he finds out that they are attempting to assassinate him as he becomes more powerful. And Muhammad is an interesting character in world history because unlike someone like Jesus, he's not only a religious leader, he's also a political leader and also a military leader. And the way that Islam spreads is severalfold. He's not afraid to take up arms and fight to spread his message, but he also is willing to go and marry various women and in some cases girls to cement political alliances with various tribal groups. Now, where things become important in understanding the Crusades is what happens after the death of Muhammad. And for the first 25 years, you have the first four rightly guided caliphs, and you begin to see this conflict that will lead to the Sunni and the Shia civil war, where the Sunni Muslims believe that their caliph should be chosen by the Islamic community, and the Shia Muslims believe that they should actually be descended directly from the line of Muhammad. And so while this is initially just a political rift between the two groups, the rift slowly begins to widen, and even in the present day, there are many different issues that are included as being an obstacle between unification of the Sunni and the Shia Muslims. And in fact, the Shia consider themselves to today be an oppressed minority living within the borders of the very wealthy Sunni community. The last two things that you learned about that were quite important in understanding the beginning of the Crusades is that after the first four rightly guided caliphs, you have a series of dynasties that emerge. The first is the Umayyad dynasty, and this is really where you start to see the leader of the Islamic world changing from an Arabic chief into a monarch with a great deal of authority. And then you have the Abbasid dynasty. This is when they move the capital over to Baghdad. They began to practice much more diverse kind of language and culture, and there's a great deal of influence from Persia. It's also the time period in which women experienced the most growing restrictions since the writing of the Quran and the life of Muhammad. And as more of the hadith are written, you begin to see women are expected to live in a veiled sort of seclusion, and there are all kinds of rules that they are expected to follow in order to remain chaste and modest. Probably the most important thing that happens during this dynasty, though, is that it actually fractures the Islamic world, because many of the military commanders and governors start to grapple for power in their regions, and what ends up happening is that it fractures into this series of sultanates, and the caliph will remain a figurehead over each one of these independent states. But once the Crusades actually begin, you actually have several different independent Muslim states, so it would be wrong to say that all Muslims were fighting together for the same cause, or that they were all even willing to support one another. And it's also going to make sense in the context of the gunpowder empires that are going to emerge after the Crusades. The Crusades actually began in 1096, and they continued for several hundred years all the way up into the 13th century. They were a series of Christian raids on the Islamic territory that brought the Holy Land, which was Jerusalem, and adjacent areas of the Mediterranean coast all the way from Antioch to the Sinai Peninsula under Christian rule, even if only for a short time. There were 7 crusades in total, so this was a war that was spread out. There were periods of peace as well as periods of intense conflict. And in order to really understand the beginning of what causes the Crusades, you have to understand a little bit about what emerged in both Europe as well as the Middle East during this time period. So the time period of the Dark Ages really ends right before the Crusades began, and this is what leads us into a historical periodization that historians would call the High Middle Ages. If you remember from the movie you watched on the Dark Ages, throughout most of the Dark Ages, there were several invasions on Western Europe, and they were completed by both the Vikings and the Magyars. And in the 11th century, these invasions really stopped. And so you begin to see that in conjunction with this, there are also some changes to the environment in the form of a great deal of warming of the climate occurring. And as it becomes warmer, they begin to be able to grow a bit more, and they have agricultural advances, and so the population begins to increase, and you see more stability within the political system and within their lives in general. And as their population increases and they're able to focus on something other than basic survival, just like with the agricultural revolution, you see a great deal more job specialization, which means that there are more people to focus on advancements than there had been during the Dark Ages. The last thing that you'll note about this time period of the High Middle Ages is that the Great Schism in 1054 really freed religious leaders in the West to focus on strengthening their supremacy. And at this point, ambitious popes start to institute reforms in the hopes of curtailing corruption and also expanding the power and prestige of the Western Church, which will definitely play a part in the start of the Crusades. Just prior to the beginning of the Crusades in the Middle East, the Seljuk Turks, which were a nomadic group from Central Asia, actually began to work as mercenaries or hired guns for the Abbasid Caliphate. And remember that it was actually the Abbasid dynasty that's the one that splintered and allowed for this cropping up of political fragmentation. And the Seljuk Turks took advantage of this by actually going in and taking control of the Muslim heartland, which was their capital city of Baghdad. They do this in 1055, and they make the Abbasid Caliph puppets of the Turkish Sultan. By the time you get to the end of the 11th century, the Seljuks have started to exert military pressure on Egypt and the Byzantine Empire. And in order to really fit in the Islamic world, they have also converted to Islam. In 1071, you find that the Seljuks are routing the Byzantine army, and they go on and they conquer Palestine and Syria and eastern Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, and they really open up the way for these encounters with both Europe and India that will occur throughout and after the Crusades. In order to really understand the causes of the Crusades, you have to keep in mind that the viewpoint of the Europeans and the Christian mindset is going to be completely different than that of the Islamic world. And so in this lecture, we're really not looking to assign blame to one or the other. And I'm going to talk about this holistically and keeping an eye out for both sides and both of their viewpoints, as it's not really a historian's job to assign a label as to who started it or who's to blame for it, but to really fully understand the big picture. And so I think it's important to understand this big picture, to actually take some of the words that were spoken by some of the powerful men who began the Crusades. And so we're going to look at Pope Urban II's speech that he gives in 1095 that really calls the Crusades to the forefront. And then we're going to look at the words of Saladin, who was one of the leaders of the Islamic world. So in 1095, Pope Urban II says, "Although, O sons of God, you have promised more firmly than ever to keep the peace among yourselves and to preserve the rights of the Church, there remains still an important work for you to do. Freshly quickened by the divine correction, you must apply the strength of your righteousness to another matter which concerns you as well as God. For your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them the aid which has often been promised them. For as the most of you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them and have conquered the territory of Romania, or the Greek Empire, as far west as the shore of the Mediterranean and the Hellespont, which is called the Arm of St. George. They have occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians, and have overcome them in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many, and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue this for a while with impurity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. On this account, I, or rather the Lord, beseech you as Christ's heralds to publish this everywhere and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends. Moreover, Christ commands it. All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission or forgiveness of sins. This I grant them through the powers of God with which I am invested. Oh, what a disgrace if such a despised and base race, which worships demons, should conquer a people which has the faith of the omnipotent, all-powerful God, and is made glorious with the name of Christ." And as you can see throughout much of this speech, Pope Urban relies on some pretty emotional language to call Christians to fight in the Crusades. He says that Muslims have gone in a series of battles and that they have desecrated the lands of Christians and that they have murdered and killed Christians. And that although this may not be at the doorstep of Western Europe yet, it's certainly going to continue that way. He also points out and calls Muslims demon worshippers and says that Christians have an obligation to God to go and stop these impure people from spreading, and that should they decide to do so, he will offer them remission of all of their sins, which is called a plenary indulgence. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in this lecture. But as you can imagine, the Muslims see this a much different way. In the words of Saladin, if God blesses us by enabling us to drive his enemies out of Jerusalem, how fortunate and happy we would be. For Jerusalem has been controlled by the enemy for 91 years, during which time God has received nothing from us here in the way of adoration. At the same time, the zeal of the Muslim rulers to deliver it languished. Time passed, and so did many in different generations, while the Franks succeeded in rooting themselves strongly there. Now God has reserved the merit of its recovery for one house, the house of the sons of Ayyub, or Saladin's family, in order to unite all hearts in appreciation of its members. So according to Saladin, there is also a great call based on religious fervor for the Muslims in being able to reconquer Jerusalem after it's been under Frank rule for the last 91 years. And he says that they want to get this territory back in order to fully worship and adore their God. While certainly primary sources are going to give us something that secondary sources won't, in the form of being a first-hand account, you have to remember to also take these with a grain of salt. Just because the person that wrote it happened to be living during that particular time period doesn't mean that they're any less biased than someone who writes an article or a book several hundred years later. And one great example of this is that one of the causes of the Crusades is based upon that first speech of Pope Urban II, that many believe that they were rescuing Eastern Christendom from the Seljuk Turks, and they viewed the Seljuks as barbarians and saw their arrival as disastrous, and certainly the Seljuk Turks were encroaching upon European territory. However, if you remember, Pope Urban also claimed that Muslims were desecrating Christian shrines in the Holy Land and that they were molesting Christian pilgrims who were en route to those shrines. And this is actually not true. It was just a piece of propaganda used by the church to really stir up sentiment. Muslims never threatened the shrines. They never cut off Christian access to them. But that tension between Christendom and Islam continued to rise, and probably the greatest perceived threat to the Byzantines was through the conquering of Constantinople by the Seljuk Turks, because this is really the start of the First Crusades. Remember that Constantinople is the heart of the Byzantine Empire, and it's one of the greatest cities of Christendom. But to be fair, although the Turks or the Muslims go in and take it over, at one point in time, the Christian forces are going to actually go in and lay siege to Constantinople as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. If you were to ask any of the European Christians what their primary cause of fighting in the Crusades was, they would likely cite cultural self-preservation. Because as Islam expanded, it really exploded across the map by conquering territories that were mostly Christian. It went into cities like Antioch and Alexandria and Carthage, and these were really centers of Christian thought and theological inquiry for centuries. And in fact, 2 of those 3 cities were part of the original patriarchate, so they were very important within Christianity. And before being taken over by Muslim armies, they really represented the Christian faith. And so they're watching these great cities fall to Muslim jihad, or this greater struggle to wipe out what they saw as infidels, those who weren't believers in Islam. And so for the coming 400 years or so after the Crusades start, the Crusaders would have really seen that they were attempting to preserve their culture against a tide of Islamic traditions and religious beliefs, which they would have seen as essentially damnable, that these were demons, and that these were people who were not motivated by God, and that if they were able to spread Islam, that they would doom the people of Europe. You'll notice that pretty much all of the Crusades focuses around Jerusalem and around who has control of this city. And it's a lot like the Zionist movement today that focuses on recapturing Israel. You'll see that all three of the Abrahamic religions, which include Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, believe that they have a claim to the Holy Land. For the Christians, of course, the claim goes back to the birth of Jesus. And for the Muslims, they believe that Ishmael was given this land by God and that they are the ones who belong here, that they should worship their God from Jerusalem. It's really one of the first things that motivates Europeans to fight, and it's also one of the reasons that Muslims are so intent on protecting Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, it's like the Crusades have played out over and over for centuries, because if you've been watching the news, you know that there have historically been issues between the Jews living in Israel and the Palestinians, and this conflict seems to be a reoccurrence of this age-old tradition of the Abrahamic religions, these first monotheistic religions, attempting to take control of what they see as their birthright. Now, the next reason that I would really assert that some people went and fought the Crusades was simply to gain wealth. And this is a pretty highly contested viewpoint. There are some historians who would disagree, saying that the majority of crusaders were wealthy knights who had no need for further land or resources, although we clearly know that human greed does not necessarily stop just because one has wealth, as you could see, for example, in our own society today. But also, I don't think that the primary sources necessarily back up that argument, and instead they support really a story in which you see some poor crusaders moving out of Western Europe and into Eastern Europe and also into the Middle East and taking advantage of the wealth they find there. So I'm actually going to read you a chronicle from the late 11th century that I believe backs up this theory. It says, "Consider, I pray, and reflect, bow in our time, God has transferred the West into the East. For we who were Occidentals now have been made Orientals. He who was a Roman or a Frank is now a Galilean, or an inhabitant of Palestine. One who was a citizen of Rheims or of Chartres now has been made a citizen of Tyre or of Antioch. We have already forgotten the places of our birth. Already they have become unknown to many of us, or at least are unmentioned. Some already possesses here homes and servants which they have received through inheritance. Some have taken wives, not merely of their own people, but Syrians or Armenians, or even Saracens who have received the grace of baptism. Our parents and relatives from day to day come to join us, abandoning, even though reluctantly, all that they possess. For those who were poor there, here God makes rich. Those who had few coins here possess countless bezants, and those who had not had a villa, here by the gift of God already possess a city. Therefore, why should one who has found the East so favorable return to the West? God does not wish those to suffer want who, carrying their crosses, have vowed to follow him, nay, even unto the end." So what this chronicler is saying is that the people who come from Western Europe, from a place of incredible poverty and this sort of rural existence and feudalism with high illiteracy rates, very high, death rates, have moved into fighting the Muslims in the Byzantine Empire and also in the Middle East, and they've been able to baptize and marry some of the women there. They've gained villas and land and entire cities, and they found great wealth. And so certainly it could be argued that there's not just a religious justification for this war, that they're not just fighting over the Holy Land or over whether Islam or Christianity will take over, but they're actually fighting also for a gaining of wealth and a bettering of their lives, and in some cases often at the expense of other people. If you remember in that initial speech of Pope Urban II, he discusses a remission of sins for those who are willing, both crusaders and noblemen and peasants alike, to go into the Holy Sepulchre or the church in the Christian quarters of Jerusalem and help take Jerusalem back, that they will receive remission for their sins. He also offers them pardon for their crimes as well as for some of the debt that they would owe. And you have to keep in mind that this is a kind of world that's much different than that of today. And this is not meant to be a criticism of religion or the institution of religion in any way. But today we often see people going to church on Sunday and they behave one way in church, and then they leave church and they behave a much different way. But in the Middle Ages, religion was really central to your life. There was no separation of church and state. Everything that you did every day was somehow directly connected with your future in the afterlife or with your thoughts and beliefs about religion. The way that they explained all of the phenomenons that happened in society, if somebody died, if crops failed, if they didn't understand something medically, it had to be explained with either superstition or with religion. And so to be promised what's called a plenary indulgence, or a remission of your sins, by the Pope after the Council of Count Clermont in 1095, that would have been something that people would have looked at extremely favorably. It would have been a reason to take up arms in the knowledge that your soul would have been granted a remission, that you would not have had to waste away in purgatory, and that you wouldn't end up in the fiery lake of hell. And people would have believed this with all of their heart, and certainly there would have been a good number who would have gone and fought in the Crusades believing that God did in fact will them to do this. This picture right here is also a primary source document, and this is actually what a plenary indulgence might have looked like. This isn't necessarily one that would have been granted for someone going to the Crusades, but perhaps for a nobleman or someone returning home. As it says, "By the authority of all the saints, and in mercy towards you, I absolve you from all sins and misdeeds, and remit all punishment for 10 days. So this might have been somebody who was home from the war and who was looking to essentially purchase their repentance so that they could wipe clean any sins that they committed for 10 days. In the modern day, one might wonder if such a thing as plenary indulgences still exist. And I think to answer this question, we should really take a sidebar and talk about Pope Francis, our newest pope, because he's actually brought this controversy back into the limelight. And if you don't know much about Pope Francis, he's a really interesting new figure. He's actually a very controversial pope. He's the first pope from South America. And some of the things he's done that are particularly controversial is that he has spoken out for more tolerant treatment of homosexuals, and he is the first pope to actually speak openly about gay people and to not just call them homosexuals or those suffering from the affliction of homosexuality. He has actually recently started building showers for the homeless outside of the Vatican. He has talked about his hope to decentralize the church and to de-emphasize the role of the Pope. He has washed the feet of the laity, including Muslims and women and prisoners. He has also said that the church should speak less about contraception, abortion, and same-sex marriage. And in comparison to other popes who have really specifically stated that these should be the priorities of the Catholic Church, he comes off as rather radical. And there's a bit of a divide between an older generation that sometimes is a little bit concerned with these new radical notions and the younger generation that tends to accept him quite openly. Now, where the story of plenary indulgences comes in is that in July of 2013, there is this Catholic Church offers indulgences for people who are celebrating something called World Youth Day. And it's for people who can't go in person to celebrate this, but if they agree to watch it over television or follow it on Twitter or Google Plus or Pinterest, they are also offered the gift of an indulgence in the same way. And a lot of people had issues with this. They believed that it was essentially selling salvation. But if you were to ask someone who was Catholic, or if you were to ask the Pope, he would say to you that really this is just an invitation to devotion. That in addition to following World Youth Day online, in order to really get out of, going to this afterlife and get rid of those penalties, you would have to also go to confession, and you would have to be sincerely devoted to the Lord and spend time praying already. That a plenary indulgence isn't that much different than going to confession, confessing your sins, saying the requisite prayers afterwards to worship your God and express your apology, and then receiving forgiveness due to your belief that Christ had spilled his blood for this. So basically, as the Catechism of the Catholic Church says, indulgences can only really be given to those who are sincere in their faith, and only for sins that have already been forgiven through going through that series of confessions. Now, if we go back to discussing the causes of the Crusades, I think it's really important to talk about this growing divergence between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. And the two were really at odds for the majority of the 11th century. The Pope saw the empire as their protector against pagan enemies, and the emperors needed the church's recognition so that the emperor's authority could be recognized as coming directly from God. But really, their symbiotic relationship ended with this. And when Henry IV became emperor in 1056, the wide divergence that existed between the papacy and the empire was pretty unmistakable, due mostly to issues with religious reform. And so the Holy Roman Empire was really divided between people who supported the Pope and those who supported German bishops that resented the Pope's reforms, and also the fact that the Pope had allied himself and the Holy Roman Empire with the Normans. And the Normans were these groups of Vikings that were coming in and invading parts of the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, in 1084, there was a council of German bishops that actually deposed Pope Gregory VII and elected their own anti-pope. How would you like to have that as your title? You'd be the anti-pope. So when Pope Urban II took the head of the church, his call for a crusade may also have partly been a pretty smart attempt to demonstrate his papal authority to impress the Holy Roman Empire, and also an attempt to reunite this empire with the papacy by focusing on a common enemy. The last really important motivation for the Crusades would be this hope to reunify Christianity after the Great Schism and after it had split into the Eastern Orthodox Church of the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Catholic Church of the Holy Roman Empire. And when the emperor actually asked Pope Gregory VII for military help, he made a point of writing down his belief that possibly through fighting the Crusades, not only could he strengthen the Holy Roman Empire, but maybe he could also lessen the tension between the West and the East and reunify the two sides of Christianity. And of course, he, the Pope, would be the one who took control of this new form of Christianity. So I think it's pretty important when you're looking at motivations and reasons that the Crusades were fought to be able to consider both viewpoints. And for each viewpoint of the Christian Crusaders, there's going to be an opposite viewpoint of the Muslims. So while the Christians believed that they were taking back their Holy Land in Jerusalem, and that the Muslims were actually desecrating their shrines and killing Christian pilgrims, the Muslims would have been upset at this form of propaganda because they weren't, in fact, desecrating the holy shrines of the Christians, and they also believed that they owned Jerusalem, that it was their holy land, and that they also were the chosen people for this holy land. So they saw the original siege of Jerusalem on their part as taking back territory that had previously belonged to them for centuries, whereas the Christians saw this as a group of outside barbarians attempting to steal Christian territory. So it's just important to keep in mind that for each argument you could make for one side, there is going to be an argument coming from the opposite side. One thing I will say, though, is that certainly one of the motivations on both sides is the spreading of their faith, but this is much more typical, I think, on the side of the Muslims, because as I've said before, we have the 5 pillars, and then there's this sort of informal 6th pillar known as jihad. There are 2 types of jihad. There is the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. Now, the greater jihad is the personal struggling of every Muslim to understand and know their God and to remain well versed in the scriptures. The lesser jihad is the jihad of the sword, which we're more familiar with, I think, since 9/11. It's been discussed a lot more in the news. The idea that within the Quran, it grants Muslims the right to protect the Ummah, or their Islamic community, and their beliefs at any cost from infidels, and that it also urges them to spread Islam through the use of force. Now we're going to look at a couple of the different crusades, at what the causes of each was and what the outcome of the battles were. Really, the spark that sets off the Crusades does not start in Europe, but it starts in the East, where the Byzantines first confront the Muslim force of the Seljuk Turks. And if you remember, this is the group that was originally hired as mercenaries by the Abbasid dynasty, but eventually took over the fractured dynasty. And in a lot of ways, they resembled the Huns or the Mongols, who had already come in and invaded the territory of the Muslims. And so it was a pretty legitimate fear when these Turkish forces started expanding into the eastern section of Asia Minor for the Byzantines. And the Byzantines met the Turks at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, and they were pretty badly defeated. They stood on the verge of losing all of Asia Minor to the Turkish onslaught, and they ended up actually turning to their last resort, which was to ask Western Europe and the Holy Roman Empire for their help. Now remember that these two don't necessarily get along. There's been the fracturing of the Catholic Church over iconoclasm and several other issues, and there have also been issues since then as a result of speaking different languages and having different cultural beliefs. And so what ends up happening is that Emperor Alexius actually latches onto this story of the Christian pilgrims being murdered and also the Christian shrines being desecrated by Muslims in order to rise the level of fury of people in the western half of the empire so that they would come to the aid of the Byzantines. And while this story wasn't necessarily true early on, over time the Muslims did begin targeting Christians in greater number, and these Christians were going on their version of the sacred Hajj into Jerusalem in some cases and to worship at these shrines. And so what the Pope is attempting to do is to reunify the severed Eastern and Western churches, and also to reunify all of Europe into one by calling for a crusade in the form of Pope Urban II. Pope Urban II warmly embraced the idea of helping Europe's beleaguered allies and fellow Christians in the East, so he proposed a holy war, a radical shift in Christian doctrine to say the least, and explained this maneuver not as any substantive change of direction, but as an extension of a policy already in place entitled the Truce of God. And this program of measures was part of the Church's attempt to limit warfare within Europe in the day by insisting there be no fighting on holidays or weekends. So in Urban's crafty hands, this Truce of God was remolded into a declaration ending all wars in which Christians fought Christians and deflecting European militarism towards what was perceived as the real enemy, which are now the Muslim infidels in the East, meaning that the Byzantines can no longer fight with Western Europeans because they're Christians. So seen ideologically, the Crusades were this culmination of a peace movement, as illogical as that might sound, and needless to say, it took some monumental rereading of the New Testament, where at least on the surface, war is hardly the preferred vehicle of peace, but in those days, the Pope had the advantage of being one of the few in Europe who could read at all, much less reread the New Testament. So, in giving knights a holy vacation and calling the vassals of Christ, Urban II was granting anyone who joined his crusades an automatic indulgence, namely the forgiveness of their prior sins. So then, instead of paying penance for murder or killing, they could get salvation as long as they slew the right sort of person, which would be a Muslim. Not since Die for Rome had Europeans heard such a stirring advertisement, and when Urban began to sense how well this was going to work, he had his marketing campaign on the road. You can liken this to some of the political campaigns of today. In a spellbinding speech, the one that I read you a segment from, before a crowd of French knights, Urban exhorted his adherents to win back the land of milk and honey and avenge the Turkish atrocities allegedly perpetrated against their fellow Christians. He cited several of the gory details sent to him by Alexius Comnenus and ended by bidding them to fight for the remission of their sins with the assurance of imperishable glory. No matter his actual words, kill Muslims indiscriminately is basically what the crowd took away from this, and he said, God wills it. God wills it. So from the perspective of history, it's clear that there was a lot more than religious frenzy working in this first crusade. The Crusades reflect other aspects of life in Europe at that time period in particular. The burgeoning population is probably one of the most significant features in the High Middle Ages. As destructive invasions began to come to a close, there was this relative calm that we discussed, and the continent quickly repopulated. It's difficult not to include then that the Crusades a century later are tied to the rapidly changing demographics within Europe, because the first three come almost exactly 40 years apart. In other words, they come at intervals of about a generation and a half, and if so, they are, in one respect, a means of bleeding off the ever-replenishing supply of young warriors, especially sons without inheritances or livelihoods, and in general, people seeking some purpose and direction in life. And there were political forces at work as well, since the Crusades were also tied to the investiture controversy, the struggle for power between the authority of Pope and the ruling political system in the Holy Roman Empire. From the papal perspective, the kings of Europe had long intruded upon the sacred right of the Pope to run his own business, that is, to choose the men who constituted the Church's administration. And in calling the First Crusade, Urban II shifted that theater of action in his political conflict to an arena where medieval knights had traditionally reigned supreme, which is the battlefield. In doing so, Urban usurped the prerogative most secular rulers had traditionally claimed. It wasn't typical for the Church to actually wage war. Worse yet, by reinterpreting that truce of God as a warrant for Europeans to kill Muslims and not to kill each other, he also sought to embrace secular leaders for all of their intra-European powers, which now looked positively un-Christian. Never mind that the Church had for centuries up until then sanctioned European upon European carnage, just not on certain days. Nevertheless, the Pope briefly owned the momentum and he set the spin. In other words, the Crusades gave them, even if it was just momentarily, the opportunity to redefine the rules of the game. But for all of the underlying causes, the major motivation driving the Crusades, both on the surface and well beneath it, was religious sentiment, something bordering on hysteria. There can be no doubt that a majority of Christian Europeans saw this call to arms as a means of salvation and a way of ridding the world of infidels. That, to them, referred not only to Muslims, but also to the Jews in Europe, whom we haven't really mentioned yet, but you'll see that the Jews become a part of the Crusades as well. Many of them are slaughtered on the way over to Jerusalem as the knights attempt to retake it. And these Christians slaughtered them because they also had a stake in the Holy Land. Ostensibly, they're going to say it's because their forefathers had murdered Jesus. If we look at the actual fighting of the First Crusade, it began in 1096 when Christian knights started to assemble from all over Europe and they moved towards Constantinople. The Byzantines were horrified to see the hordes of Western Europeans knocking at their doors, especially because most of the Crusaders were poor, and worse still, they were extremely poorly armed. When he had made his initial request, Alexius Comnenus had not asked the Pope for mobs of indigent desperadoes, but he had asked for a small force of skilled fighters who could help him repulse the Turks. And to the Byzantines, what they saw was really not any army suitable to help them. The lowest estimate of the Crusaders' force is around 25,000, and there were probably a lot more than this, perhaps as many as 100,000. And as far as the Byzantines were concerned, it was an uncivilized, ill-equipped throng driven by a sort of fanaticism as poorly cloaked in words of faith and brotherhood as their ragged outfits were. Moreover, the Crusaders' aims corresponded little with those of the Byzantines, who were seeking to stop the tide of Turkish aggression, and the Europeans, on the other hand, entertained these fantasies of liberating Jerusalem and the Holy Lands from Muslim oppression, and neither really understood or even listened to the other's words. They certainly weren't a unified force with unified causes for fighting the war, and as a result, the Byzantines acted in a fashion that was typical of Easterners, from the Western European perspective at least, and following a long-standing policy of baffling, stalling, and deceiving intrusive foreigners, Alexius actually greeted the Crusaders with cold but kind of reasonable hospitality, and as soon as it was feasible, he escorted them through his kingdom and beyond the eastern boundary of the Byzantine Empire, and vowed that military and financial support would follow. And once they were gone, the emperor promptly reneged on his deal and slammed the gate shut and prevented this ragtag group from returning. And surely he thought the Turks would make quick work of them, that they would just rush through them and annihilate them, and he would be free of this pest. But the Byzantines really underestimated the will of these crusaders from Western Europe, and by defaulting on his pledge of support, he earned Europe's distrust and that of the Pope as well. And Byzantium was now as much the Crusaders' foe as the Muslim state had been. So at length and against all odds, a lot of the Crusaders survived this betrayal. After all, as poor folk, most of them were used to getting by on just a little bit of food, and they didn't have a whole lot of comforts. So they drew onward because of their religious convictions, and they managed to get further than anyone ever guessed they would. They made it all the way to Syria, and somehow they engineered the capture of the capital city of Antioch in June of 1098. Though it proved a long and arduous siege, their victory gave new life to their cause, and continuing on south, they pushed their way into the Holy Lands, where they actually besieged and took Jerusalem the next year. And instrumental in that success was a brutality that was astonishing in its barbarity and ruthlessness. It was bloody enough to make a Viking proud. Of course, most of these were actually related to the Vikings genetically or culturally to the Normans, and treating the defeated as no better than animals, the Crusaders ravaged this entire population of Jerusalem. They captured Antioch, they exterminated all the Turks there, and later, after the sack of Jerusalem, they boasted of their own savagery and claimed, "We rode in the blood of the infidels up to the knees of our horses." And if this is true, it's pretty horrific. If it's invented history, it's almost worse. Whatever the case, the Crusaders' disregard of basic human decency has struck few over time as anything but utterly repugnant. And worse yet, there were few Crusaders who had any long-term interest in settling the Holy Lands. They didn't want to live in Jerusalem. With Jerusalem now seemingly secured in Christian hands, most of its Western assailants wanted to go and return back home, where they were hailed as heroes. Some stayed and set up a Christian-run government. Then this forms into these four so-called Crusader states along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And here they actually build these European-style castles. They're called cracks. And it's somewhat disconcerting to look across Syria today, and you'll see these crumbling medieval castles of a sort that you would expect to find in England or in France that are vestiges of these Crusader states. So along with the other devastations they wrought, like the hatred they inspired between the East and the West, the Crusades also brought this huge disharmony to the cultural landscape of the area, arguably one of the most enduring legacies of their outrage. So, given the bloody nature of the siege of Jerusalem and the legacy of this capture by the Christian crusaders, I just wanted to read you a small section of a primary source account of this capture of Jerusalem. And it starts out, "Moreover, the city is laid out most beautifully, and cannot be criticized for too great length or as being disproportionately narrow. On the west is the Tower of David, which is flanked on both sides by the broad wall of the city. The lower half of the wall is solid masonry, of square stones and mortar, sealed with molten lead. So strong is this wall that 15 or 20 men should be well supplied with provisions, they would never be taken by any army. When the Franks saw how difficult it would be to take the city, the leaders ordered scalding ladders to be made, hoping that by a brave assault it might be possible to surmount the walls by means of ladders, and thus attack the city, God helping. So the ladders were made, and on the day following the 7th, in the early morning, the leaders ordered the attack, and with the trumpets sounding, a splendid assault was made on the city from all sides. The attack lasted until the 6th hour, but it was discovered that the city could not be entered by the use of ladders, which were few in number, and sadly we ceased the attack. Then a council was held, and it was ordered that siege machines should be constructed by the artisans, so that by moving them close to the wall we might accomplish our purpose with the aid of God. This was done. When the tower had been put together, and had been covered with hides, it was moved nearer to the wall. Then knights, few in number but brave, at the sound of the trumpet, took their place in the tower and began to shoot stones and arrows. The Saracens defended themselves vigorously, and with slings very skillfully hurled back burning firebrands which had been dipped in oil and fresh fat. Many on both sides, fighting in this manner, often found themselves in the presence of death. On the following day the work again began at the sound of the trumpet, and to such purpose that the rams, by continual pounding, made a hole through one part of the wall. The Saracens suspended 2 beams before the opening, supporting them by ropes, so that by piling stones behind them they would make an obstacle to the rams. However, what they did for their own protection became, through the providence of God, the cause of their own destruction. For when the tower was moved nearer the wall, the ropes that supported the beams were cut. From these same beams the Franks constructed a bridge, which they cleverly extended from the tower to the wall. About this time one of the towers in the stone wall began to burn, for the men who worked our machines had been hurling firebrands upon it until the wooden beams within it caught fire. The flames and smoke soon became so bad that none of the defenders of this part of the wall were able to remain near this place. At the noon hour on Friday, with trumpets sounding amid great commotion and shouting, God help us, the Franks entered the city. When the pagans saw one standard planted on the wall, they were completely demoralized, and all their former boldness vanished, and they turned to flee through the narrow streets of the city. Those who were already in rapid flight began to flee more rapidly. Count Raymond and his men, who were attacking the wall on the other side, did not yet know of this until they saw the Saracens leap from the wall in front of them. Forthwith they joyfully rushed into the city to pursue and kill the nefarious enemies, as their comrades were already doing. Some Saracens, Arabs, and Ethiopians took revenge in the Tower of David. Others fled to the temples of the Lord and of Solomon. A great fight took place in the court and porch of the temples, where they were unable to escape from our gladiators. Many fled to the roof of the temple of Solomon, and were shot with arrows, so that they fell to the ground dead. In this temple almost 10,000 were killed. Indeed, if you had been there, you would have seen our feet colored to our ankles with the blood of the slain. But what more shall I relate? None of them were left alive, neither women nor children were spared. It's also really important to not forget that there was a Jewish element within the Crusades, and this starts with the very first crusade and with a not necessarily the birth of anti-Semitism, but certainly a furthering of anti-Semitic thought. And the next primary source I want to read to you is actually from the Jewish chronicler Solomon Bar Samson from the year 1096. And he writes, "At this time, arrogant people, a people of strange speech, a nation bitter and impetuous, Frenchmen and Germans set out for the holy city, which had been desecrated by barbaric nations, there to seek their house of idolatry, and banish the Ishmaelites or the Muslims, and other denizens of the land. Their ranks swelled until the number of men, women, and children exceeded a locust horde, covering the earth. Now it came to pass that as they passed through the towns where Jews dwelled, they said to one another, 'Look now, we are going a long way to seek out the profane shrine, and to avenge ourselves on the Ishmaelites. When here in our midst are the Jews, they whose forefathers murdered and crucified him for no reason. Let us first avenge ourselves on them and exterminate them from among the nations, so that the name of Israel will no longer be remembered, or let them adopt our faith and acknowledge the offspring of promiscuity.'" So within this chronicler says that the Christians came in and said that either the Jews needed to convert to Christianity or they were going to be killed. And they claim the reason for the killing is because the Jews' forefathers had killed Jesus themselves. However, it's also likely that one of the reasons for this killing is because the Jews also held a claim to the Holy Land of Jerusalem, and that if they went ahead and wiped out these people, they wouldn't have to worry about fighting the Jews after they finished fighting the Muslims, who they call the Ishmaelites in this passage. The Second Crusade is the heir, so to speak, of the first. Not only did it follow a generation or so after the first, it was actually a number of its soldiers were the actual descendants of those who had gone on the first crusade. But the later crusade was also precipitated by the earlier one. So in more ways than one, the first crusade really sires the second crusade. In the decades following the first crusade, the Christian overlords of these crusader states failed to really integrate themselves into Middle Eastern society in any kind of meaningful way. They despised the native population, and that population despised them for their imperious and condescending nature, and many turned out to be cruel and abusive and despotic in their reign. Though there was a minority that proved kinder and gentler, the general impression of their rule was pretty far from favorable, and even their fellow Christians didn't like them very much, as witnessed by one of the churchmen who wrote home complaining they devoted themselves to all kinds of debauchery and allowed their womenfolk to spend whole nights at wild parties. They mixed with trashy people and drank the most delicious wines. And this situation really couldn't endure for long. It was in 1144 that one of the Crusader states first fell back into Muslim hands, and it reignited this crusading fever in Europe and led to the call for a follow-up crusade to re-secure the Holy Land in the name of Christ. And it was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux who was perceived by many as the holiest man of his day, who endorsed the notion of a new crusade, and his sanction drew in many of the leading figures, such as the kings of Europe. He had the sense to really protect the homeland first, and he forbade the massacre of Jews, this sad overture that had opened up the earlier crusade. But in the end, the second crusade proved a pretty dismal failure. This time the Byzantines and the Turks were ready for the Franks, as they called them, and that is the Western barbarians, and they plotted together to exterminate them. So the Byzantines were actually helping the Muslim forces, and so betrayed on both sides by Byzantium and Turkish forces, the Second Crusades was what nearly obliterated the Crusaders as they tried to pass through Asia Minor. And what little of the expedition made it to the Holy Lands only ended up fighting with the survivors and the descendants of the First Crusades, who saw these new Europeans coming into their lands as a band of thugs who were there to rob them of their lands. It was pretty much all chaos breaking loose. You've got Byzantine Christians fighting with Muslims against Western Europeans, and then you've got the ancestors of the first wave of Crusaders fighting against this new wave of Crusaders, hoping to keep their land and their wealth. And the result was that most participants of the Second Crusade went back to Europe empty-handed. And it was such a pitiful group that St. Bernard was forced to admit, "I must call him blessed who is not tainted by this." That killed most Europeans' interest in crusading for about a generation or so, until we lead into the Third Crusade. Just like the Second Crusades, the Third Crusades were also precipitated by a turnover of power in the Middle East. Especially in this case in Europe, there was a new Muslim leader who arose named Saladin, and if you remember, I actually read one of his speeches earlier on. He goes in and he recaptures Syria, and he takes most of the Holy Lands, including Jerusalem, in 1187, and his assault is so forceful that the Crusader states are reduced to little more than this port of Tyre and a few remaining castles. And with Jerusalem no longer in their hands, Christians say that some kind of reprisal is called for, and of course this is going to be another crusade. But this time they're going to have one that's well organized and well equipped, and they figure there's no one better to do this than the foremost regents of Europe. And so the kings of Germany, France, and England all come together. So the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the French King Philip Augustus, and Richard the Lion-Hearted, the King of England, actually put aside their political differences, and you see once again this diverging of various interests within the Holy Roman Empire coming together in order to fight a common enemy. And that enemy, of course, is an affront to Christendom at large. And this very large, well-funded, planned-out trip had absolutely no chance of success, probably because of the fact that it was headed by 3 different people. So first, along the way to Jerusalem, Frederick Barbarossa actually drowns while crossing a river, and he either drowns because he had a heart attack or because he fell off his horse and his armor was so heavy he couldn't swim back up to the surface. And his troops, who didn't have a leader, then turned back and went back home. Then you had Philip and Richard having a huge quarrel, and according to the gossip of the court, the personal issue they were trying to work out was that Richard was gay, and that he had made advances towards Philip, and that this complicated relationship actually caused Philip to not want to help with the siege of Jerusalem, and he goes back to France. So he leaves Richard all alone with his forces, not enough of an army to retake Jerusalem, but they continue on anyway. And when they reach the Middle East, Richard goes and he meets with Saladin, and they, after a bit of jousting and some general medieval male bonding, if you can trust the accounts of that day, they manage to forge an agreement to let Christians visit the Holy Lands without being hassled. But making deals with Muslims was not really viewed favorably as the point of crusading. So Richard's stock really drops precipitously with his people, and when he's on his way home, he gets captured. But he's not captured by Muslim forces. He's captured by Germans. Actually, he's captured by the son of his former ally, Frederick Barbarossa, who had died in the river. And he's imprisoned and held in exchange for the payment of £100,000, which is an exorbitant sum, and it's literally a king's ransom that nearly bankrupts England and leaves his brother, Richard, a regent and his successor, in deep debt and in trouble. And the Crusades have ended up being 1 for 3, where the Christians have generally lost and the Muslims have had the upper hand. Now, if crusading was going to continue at all, it was going to need some serious restructuring, and having failed in so many respects, the Third Crusade entailed disappointments that no one in Europe could ignore. And for one, it hadn't returned Jerusalem and the Holy Land to Christian control. For another, it had led to bitter infighting within Europe, which ran directly counter to its Truce of God mission to repress any of those wars on the home front, and that was at least in part because it hadn't deflected the restless aggression of Europe's knights outside of the West. By those standards, the Third Crusade might as well not have happened at all, which really helps to explain why the Fourth Crusade followed so quickly on its heels. So meanwhile, there were other changes afoot within the European community. In particular, by the start of the 13th century, the papacy had found a strong advocate in Pope Innocent III. He was the most effective pope in medieval history, and this young, very intelligent pontiff had been trained in the law, and he spoke the language of international diplomacy better than most of the political rulers did in Europe. Indeed, he was probably the best statesman who was ever to be named pope. His ability to craft strategies promoting the interest of the church and to put them into effect is unparalleled in Western history, so he gave the next crusade a professional appearance of a sort that the Crusades hadn't really had before. But Europe soon learned that amateurism really suited crusading better and that this didn't help them at all. With Innocent spearheading the venture, it was bound to succeed somehow. So the Pope starts doing his history homework, from which he devises a means to avoid the hazards, which had basically tripped up those in the last crusade. What had drowned the most recent one was the division of leadership among the three kings, and Innocent resolved to avoid that error by putting himself in charge alone. So he's not going to share the power with anybody. What had foundered the Second Crusade was the treachery of the double-dealing Byzantines. So the decision was made to send the next wave of crusaders by sea. That way they could avoid Byzantium entirely. And the Fourth Crusade would eventually end up in downtown Constantinople. This is sort of a rousing tribute to human folly, not an indictment of Innocent's plan. And if everything went the way that he had arranged, it would have been a perfectly fine crusade, but the best laid plans of the Pope did not go as well as he had hoped. Innocent arranged to contract ships and supplies from the port city of Venice, and at this point it was a great sea power, and it looked like smooth sailing on paper at least, which is what lawyer popes tend to look at. But problems developed before the Crusades really even got on board. All participants thought someone else was paying for the rental of the ships. So when the Crusaders started to arrive in Venice and were greeted with outstretched hands, no one had any money to offer, and the deal almost fell through. There are more ways than one for a large contingent of warriors to earn their passage on sea. So, for instance, Zara, one of the Venice's subject states of the eastern shore of the Adriatic Sea, had just recently revolted from the city's maritime empire. And in order to avoid a Venetian reprisal, the people of Zara had delivered their city into the Pope's warm and welcoming embrace, and Zara was now part of the papal state, a growing mutual fund owned and managed by the Roman Church. So Zara gets protection from Venice, and the Roman Church gets the services of the Zarian citizens. In exchange for cash on delivery, the Venetians contracted with the Crusaders to stop in at Zara on their way out east and force it back under Venice's thumb. Such an agreement was certainly not part of Innocent's plan for the crusade. That is, his goals did not include that the crusaders he'd assembled would strip his papacy of newly won territory. And when he learned about their agreement with the Venetians, especially since this was double dealing, he withdrew his support of the crusade along with his funding. And when that didn't stop him, or them, he laid a writ of excommunication on them all. That is, he effectively ousted them from the church and condemned their souls to perdition. And that too made zero difference in their arrangements. The Crusaders sailed to Zara and duly delivered it back into the Venetian hands. They betrayed the people they had originally agreed to help. While lingering in the area, the Crusaders came across a Byzantine exile, a pretender to the throne who had recently been exiled to Byzantium, and who offered them a substantial sum if they would make him the emperor. With the sanction of the Venetians, who saw absolutely nothing wrong in causing some turmoil in the Byzantine Empire, their trading rival in the Mediterranean, the Crusaders were again diverted from the Holy Lands. This time, they headed in the direction of Constantinople. There, the Crusaders' approach inspired considerable panic among the Byzantines. Not an unreasonable reaction, as this now well-funded seaborne assault force bore down on them. The reigning emperor, along with many others, fled the city and met no real resistance. The Crusaders entered the capital and set their Latin nominee for emperor on the throne, then turned around and headed for the Holy Land at last. So far, this expedition could hardly be called a crusade. It was mostly a floating band of hitmen for hire, who went in and attacked the greatest city in Christendom, they again attacked their own people. They had hardly left the harbor at Constantinople when their Latin pretender was murdered. After the news of his assassination reached them, the Crusaders turned their ships around and headed back to secure the situation, if for nothing else than to fortify their supply lines. They were getting supplied by this pretender to the throne in the Byzantine Empire, and with him dead, who would supply the war? Their earlier treacheries would now come back to haunt the Byzantines. When the Crusaders found the city bolted tight against them, the stage was set for a siege, and the odds were strongly in the Byzantines' favor. In all the centuries since its founding by the Roman Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, Constantinople had never succumbed to an assault from the outside. But contrary to historical precedent, these crusading marauders, who seemed determined to fight anyone but Muslims, accomplished the seemingly impossible. At long last, the heavens failed Byzantium, and the capital city fell to siege for the first time ever, and not to the hands of Muslims or Vikings or Mongols. Not that all of those hadn't at some point tried to take Constantinople, but to the descendants of the Byzantines' closest relatives, Western Europeans, the other heirs of Rome. To put it another way, when Constantine's new Rome finally went down, the culprit was the original Rome. The sacking of Constantinople that resulted for 3 days, though its tremors are still felt today, was great. For one, the great library there was destroyed when the Crusaders ransacked it, even stabling their horses inside the library. It's horrifying to think how much ancient learning and literature was lost in that catastrophe. It's almost certain the complete works of some ancient authors whose writings now exist only in tattered fragments, some entirely lost, were housed in this library once. For me, it's my worst nightmare. Worse yet, the fire set in that dark year became a cataclysmic blaze 2 centuries later. In 1453, the Turks relit the flames of siege, and having seen it done before, they again went in and took over Byzantium. So, ironically, it was actually the Christian Crusaders' siege of Constantinople that paved the way for the Muslims to eventually take over the entire area and make it a part of the Islamic world. In besieging 2 cities, neither of which were Muslim at the time, the men of the Fourth Crusade clearly thought they had done enough. Feeling no particular need to proceed on to the Holy Lands, they returned to Europe with their spoils of conquest, and given that they had briefly reunited East and West, healing momentarily the schism in the Church, Innocent III had little choice but to forgive and recommunicate these crusaders. So they paraded in triumph, bearing the plunder of the East, gold relics, and all sorts of memorabilia, though very few books of learning. In fact, remarkably little of any intellectual substance would come of the ransacked Byzantines. It was as if all of Europe in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade was collectively wearing a souvenir t-shirt that read, "My uncle sacked Constantinople, and all I got was a big bronze horse." The next wave of crusading came soon after the Fourth Crusade, which, just like the Third, had depleted very little of Europe's material resources and manpower. It was a perceived success in the hindsight when the siege of Constantinople actually reinvigorated Western Europeans' interest in religious warfare with the East. None of the subsequent crusades, the 5th, 6th, or the 7th, resembled the immediate forebearers very much, certainly not in their constituency or in their outcome, which perhaps is a blessing. The 5th Crusade was called by Pope Innocent III against the Albigensians in France, and it's called the Albigensian Crusade. It took several years to complete, and it was not directed against a Muslim foe, as these previous wars had been, and not against a Byzantine one either. The ostensible aim was to rid southern France of this heretical sect that refused to recognize the authority of the Church. And in reality, it promoted infighting within Europe. But it had been a long time since Crusaders had to worry about the truce of God, and they now accepted the Crusades for what they'd always been. They were military missions that were launched against churches, or at least against the Pope's enemies. So even if the rewards were still the same, they fought different people. And namely, one could still earn a place in heaven, not only by fighting infidels, they didn't just fight Muslims, but also you could fight your neighbors in Europe. As long as they were the enemy of the Pope, you could still receive a plenary indulgence. And this proved very attractive to many because it was much less risky to go on a crusade close to home as opposed to trekking hundreds of miles across hostile and sometimes barren lands to rescue Jerusalem from ungrateful heathens. And by heathens, this is, of course, what the Christians would have called them. And so, in reality, the Crusades weren't necessarily just a clashing between the values of Christians and Muslims, but between the values of Christians and pagans in France, and also Christians and Jews. And as evidence of just how hard it was to mount a foreign expedition, no Western army had even come near the Holy City since Richard the Lionhearted shook lances with Saladin. Still, not even trying to head east seemed to many so far from the true spirit of crusading that Innocent's campaign against southern France is really never numbered as a crusade. History in its own age agreed that this was not the Fifth Crusade, but the Albigensian Crusade, and that says it all. What no crusade since the Second had achieved, the mass exportation of European aggression and manpower outside of the West, was accomplished. It killed thousands of disenfranchised European-born hotheads and bled off their pent-up hostility far away from their homeland, even though this expedition to the east was still not aimed squarely at the Holy Lands. They were sent by sea to Egypt instead, because ocean travel had been so good to them during the Fourth Crusade, and these benighted knights landed on the shores of the Nile just at the time of its annual flood. It trapped them in the high waters, and they met a collective watery death at the hands of the natives there. With this, the consequences of ignorance have really shown that the West embraced a lack of intellect since the fall of Rome. For if these crusaders had read their Herodotus instead of burning the library and housing their horses within the library, they would have known about the flooding of the Nile. But since virtually nobody in Europe could read Greek, how could they have anticipated the perils they faced? The Fifth Crusade stands alone as one of the best arguments ever for the practical merits of studying history and for the value of a liberal arts education. So take what you learn in this class seriously. Otherwise, you might get stuck in the rising tides. Now, like the Albigensian Crusade, the next European expedition to the east is not numbered either. This one also disqualified for being too far from the spirit of crusading. It was dubbed Frederick's Crusade because its leader was the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. It was neither called for nor sanctioned by the papacy, but was in fact an attempt to forge peaceable relations with the Middle East. Even after Frederick managed to return Jerusalem to Christian control, the Pope still didn't acknowledge it as a crusade, and this is because it had been done through diplomacy. Now, if Pope Innocent was still alive, he probably would have liked the diplomatic finesse that was used by Frederick, but he had already passed away. And beside that, it wasn't long after the truce was made that the Muslims went back in and retook Jerusalem. Now, the last of these military expeditions are the Sixth and the Seventh Crusades, and each of them are led by King Louis, the King of France, and both prove to be utter failures. Louis, in fact, dies leading the latter, and in neither does he come anywhere near the Holy Lands. These crusades don't do much more than to ensure that the king's journey to canonization is a safe trip, so to speak. So when in 1291 the last Christian outpost in the Middle East, the port city of Acre, fell to Muslim forces, the Crusades were brought to a close. And as a sign of this, at his great centennial jubilee in 1300, a celebration of Christianity's might and longevity, Pope Boniface VIII offered indulgences to Christian pilgrims if they would crusade to Rome and not to Jerusalem. It was the papacy's veritable admission that crusading had failed, as if to say, there's no point anymore in fighting for the Holy Lands. We have lost. The second part of your essay question this week asks you a bit about the legacy of the Crusades, on the mindset of people in the West towards the East and of those in the East towards the West. But in order to understand that, you really need to understand what the overall impact of the Crusades were. And so first I would say that they lead to the fall of the Byzantine Empire. This happens when the Ottoman Empire actually conquers the Byzantines, and you see the fall of Constantinople in 1453 under Sultan Mehmed II. The next thing you see is that despite the fact that the Europeans don't really win the Crusades, the Pope does strengthen his position within Europe. He is able to create a common enemy for the people living in the Holy Roman Empire, and people begin to look to him as more of a centralized leader than previously. Another perhaps unexpected result of the Crusades is possibly the growth of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, all the way along the path to Jerusalem, the Crusaders would see these plantations in which the Muslims would have slaves, typically from North Africa, working to produce olives so that they could create olive oil. And they took this idea of these plantations and they brought them to the sugar plantations during the Age of Exploration that existed in the Caribbean, for example. And then later they brought it into the southern United States with the cotton plantation system and the tobacco plantation system. And it's possible that we would have had the transatlantic slave system regardless of whether this had been found out during the Crusades, but I think that you could certainly say that more individuals were trafficked out of Africa as a result of needing them for labor because of this methodology that was learned from Muslims during the Crusades. Another important aspect is the idea of cultural diffusion. If you remember, really Western Europe was in the Dark Ages for most of the Middle Ages, and because of this, there wasn't a whole lot of extensive learning or technological advances. But both China and the Islamic world were at the forefront of advances. And so you see with the Crusades that Islamic scholarship begins to spread throughout Europe. The best example of this is when they recover the library at Toledo. And also, some of the lost classical era research and scholarship begins to actually make its way back out into the light. And the best example of this is that during the Reconquista of Spain, some of the ancient Greek works were found and rediscovered by European scholars who for hundreds of years had really virtually forgotten they existed. And probably the last aspect of cultural diffusion that becomes very important is that Europeans pick up this taste for luxury items from the Islamic world when they're fighting in the Crusades, and they also have a taste for luxury goods from parts of Asia. And this is going to really lead to the Age of Exploration because they're going to desire things like cloves and mace and pepper and spices and cotton from India. And perhaps they'll also look for roots such as rutabaga that they can use for their medicine, and eventually also coffee. And it's going to lead to this expedition of Western Europe into the rest of the world. Another aspect of the impact of the Crusades is the hardening of cultural barriers. While Pope Urban II really hoped that he'd be able to reunite Christianity, you see that there's a solidification of differences between those who identify as Eastern Orthodox Christians and those who identify as Roman Catholics. But even beyond this, there's certainly a hardening between the Christians and the Jews. There's a spread of anti-Semitism that is going to kind of reach a fever pitch in Europe, and it's going to come out and become a part of World War I and certainly a part of World War II. And this isn't necessarily the birth of anti-Semitism, but it's really one of the reasons that it spread so rapidly, especially as many of the Jewish people were murdered and often burned at the stake as the Crusaders were heading into and out of Jerusalem. You may have noticed that when I discussed the hardening of cultural barriers, I did not mention the barrier between Muslims and Christians because I think it's unfair to say that the Crusades caused Christians to fear Muslims. They really already viewed them with fear and disdain well before the Crusades ever started. But what the Crusades actually did is that they actually improved Christian and Muslim relations because they increased contact between the Muslims and the Christians so that they didn't seem like such foreign or mythical outsiders. And in fact, Muslim men were often viewed by the Western half of Christendom as romantic and dashing and chivalric warriors, and Muslim women were either viewed as beautiful and intelligent and resourceful, or as beautiful and cunning and resourceful. But there was in some way a respect for who they were as people. Muslims, for their part, certainly admired Christian warriors. They thought that they were incredibly courageous, and they admired the fact that they were willing to defend their faith. But they did see them as rash and uncultured in the same way that the Christians saw the Muslims as barbarians. And they also thought that Christian women were a little bit too loose, that they freely allowed strange men into their company. And so they didn't necessarily understand the culture of the opposing side, but at least they had been further exposed to it, so that over time there could become a greater understanding of one another. At the end of this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the gunpowder empires that emerged following the end of the Crusades, but it's safe to say that the Muslim world really expands because of their victory in the Crusades between the 15th and 17th centuries. And ultimately, this actually leads Western Europeans to start the age of exploration or the age of discovery, because the Europeans have that taste for luxury goods from Asia, but in order to get those goods, they have to travel through Islamic territory. And in fact, the papacy threatened merchants who traded with Muslims with excommunication for trading with their enemy. So rather than being able to go across the land routes or the sea routes that would utilize territory owned by the Muslims, they needed to find a way to go across the Atlantic Ocean and come along the backside and enter into China and India that way. And a lot of European empire building in the New World is seen as an extension of the Crusades. It's still got the same motivation of God wills it. When Columbus, for example, writes that he hopes to reach Jerusalem by sailing west instead of traveling east, because that route is closed by the Muslims, he realizes eventually that this is impractical and he's not going to be successful. And so he looks at the Americas and Hispaniola when he discovers it, and he believes that it's a new opportunity that has been sent to him directly by God in order to compensate the faithful, him and his men, for the loss of the Holy Land, of Jerusalem, during the Crusades. Another example of how this is an extension of the Crusades is that during the Crusades there was a military religious order. It was called the Order of Christ, and it was set up in 1319 by the King of Portugal. And the whole point of it was to continue the war against the Muslims in Spain. However, you see that when the Crusades end, they actually end up playing a really large role in the mission work that goes on in the Portuguese exploration of the Americas. And a great deal of the missionaries, the Dominican and the Jesuit missionaries who come to the New World, see themselves as following the mandates of Pope Urban II, as bringing a civilizing impulse of Christianity to barbaric people. And they compare Native Americans and indigenous people in many ways to the Muslims at the start of the Crusades. The Crusades also have a strong impact on art and culture and literacy, in that they lead, because of the creation of the gunpowder empires, to this flowering of Islamic art, culture, literacy, and education. It's known as the second flowering of Islam. But they also cause a lot of Europeans to flee Italy when the Muslim forces began advancing on that portion of Europe. And this is really the impetus for the start of the Renaissance, because many of the incredibly wealthy people who fled to Italy began to patronize painters and sculptors and artists, people like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. And essentially, this brings us into the modern era of the concept of humanism and rationalism, the idea of using reason and the scientific revolution and the search for empirical evidence rather than a basis of superstition or religious dogma. And it also brings us to a resurgence of a modern age of democracy in the form of the Enlightenment and the ideals that are brought to fruition through the Atlantic revolutions. Now, I'm not saying that had the Crusades never happened, that this also wouldn't have happened, but that the Crusades were certainly essential in causing the beginning of this sort of shift from ancient history to modern history, and that it may have happened differently in a different place or at a different time without the help of the Crusades. While the Christians aren't successful in winning the Crusades do show that the Christians and the European world is moving out of the Dark Ages. They show that they're able to finance and mobilize a large army through a very well-staffed and organized bureaucracy. And the Crusades actually encouraged the development of taxation in order to finance the Crusades, which still has a major impact on European lives, as this taxation system remained in place well after the end of the Crusades, for better or for worse. In my opinion, one of the most important impacts of the Crusades is that of the Protestant Reformation. Remember that Pope Urban II had guaranteed plenary indulgences for fighting in the Crusades. And it was this direct cause that led Martin Luther to protest the Catholic Church when he went to the door of the church in Wittenberg and tacked up his 95 Theses. And these 95 Theses included a full list of all the problems he had with the Catholic Church. He certainly mentioned corruption of the church, the fact that the church was often dealing with money more than it was dealing with helping people. He mentioned sexual corruption, the fact that often the clergy had sexual relationships. Some of them were secretly married, for example, or visited brothels. He discussed the ritualistic nature of Catholicism, but up at the very top of that list was what he saw as the selling of salvation. And he also pointed out the fact that he did not believe the church should be organizing armed warfare. He said that this was the responsibility of secular princes. This was the realm of politics, not of the church. And I think what happens next is really a good example of the kind of issue that can emerge when the papacy and the leader of an empire or of a country don't get along. Because this Protestant Reformation and this agitation for reform was already building, King Henry VIII in England, who is incredibly famous, decides to take advantage of this religious dissent. He had been married for quite some time to a woman named Catherine of Aragon, and they even had a daughter together named Mary. But at this point, he met a woman named Anne Boleyn. And despite having slept with her sister, and possibly having slept with her mother as well, he decided that he wanted to divorce Catherine and marry Anne. And in the Catholic Church, it simply is not possible to get a divorce at this time. You can get an annulment, however. And according to Henry, he began to accuse Catherine, who had married his brother first, of having consummated that relationship. Now, the truth of the story is, Catherine probably never had intercourse with his brother. His brother was incredibly sick, and they were married for a very short period of time before he died, and Henry knew all about this marriage before he ever married Catherine. So it was certainly just a plea to get Catherine to leave and go join a convent and allow him to remarry. For her part, Catherine was a staunch Catholic, and she refused to acknowledge this. She said that she refused to lie so that he could get a divorce. So Henry VIII sends out a messenger to the Pope, and he asks for permission to get an annulment. And in the Catholic Church, if you've never had any kind of sexual relationship, an annulment can be possible. But of course, the Pope sends out a decree, and he says in his dispensation that he will not grant King Henry a divorce from his wife, that he does not believe that she was impure or that they're related in any way other than as husband and wife. And so Henry VIII decides that he is actually going to jump on this bandwagon of Protestant reform, and he is going to change the entire religion of England to Protestantism, or Anglicanism to be more specific. When this happens, he no longer has to have the Pope's authority in order or permission in order to get a divorce. And he divorces Catherine, he banishes her, and he marries Anne Boleyn. And probably at some point you've heard the story before where he goes on and he successively marries 5 different women. Some of them die in childbirth. Some, like Anne Boleyn, are eventually beheaded. Anne was actually accused of being a witch and accused of sleeping with her brother at one point before he beheaded her. And so the story of Henry VIII is incredibly sordid, and it's full of a lot of juicy details. And there was a movie that came out called The Other Boleyn Girl that's based on a book by Philippa Gregory, if you're interested in this topic. And also Netflix has the series The Tudors available, which follows the life of Henry VIII, in particular his marriage to his first wife and all of his succeeding wives. And it's a very good series. So what I would say about the Protestant Reformation is that although the Great Schism in 1054 started the fracturing of Christianity, the Crusades and the selling of plenary indulgences really lead to this Reformation, which further begins to fracture Christianity, and you'll see that it fractures even further in splinters between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic, and then from Roman Catholic to the Protestants. And then beneath that, you'll begin to see it fracturing out even further into Puritans and Pilgrims and Methodists and Lutherans. And it's the reason why when you walk down a street in the Bible Belt today, you'll see a huge variety of different churches to choose from, because there are periodically these fragmentations of Christianity, this being one of the most important. So the last part of the essay you're working on this week asks you about the legacy of the Crusades today in the mindset of the people in both the West as well as the Middle East. And if you look at the time period directly after the Crusades, for almost a millennium after the Crusades ended, nobody in either area really cared much about them. The Christians were pretty wrapped up in the Greek and Roman past, and Muslims, if they thought about foreign invaders, were probably more likely to think about the trauma of when the Mongols actually invaded their territory. This doesn't change until the 19th century, and this changes because of the rise of nationalism. You start finding there are these patriotic historians who go in and rediscover the Crusades, and they use these as heroic examples of French and British and German chivalry and martial valor. And sometimes they'll twist the story of the Crusades to back up the propagandic piece they're writing. It really flourishes during World War I, when medieval legends offered this romantic alternative to a very grim war with trench warfare, and the early aviators became the knights of the air. And you'll see on some of those early World War I planes, they've got the same crosses emblazoned across them that you would see on the Crusaders' uniforms. It helps certainly that the Crusades are among the few times that the British and the French actually fought on the same side rather than against one another, because once again, with the world wars, you see this happening. Because Christians identified with the Crusaders in the years following the Crusades, the opponents of the Christians, like the Ottomans during World War I, naturally identified with Muslim leaders like Saladin, the commander who had famously recaptured Jerusalem. The Crusaders served then, as well as today, as a metaphor for enemies to better articulate the hatred of the people. Post-World War I, Crusader-themed nationalism proved popular with Europe's fascist right, which is part of the reason it loses its luster in the West, especially when Hitler and the Nazi Party begins to pick up the guise of the crusading trend. Now, the Crusades rhetoric also remained popular in association with Israel, and there's really a sad irony to the fact that Zionists identify as crusaders. The first real issue with this, of course, is that the Crusades were an unmitigated disaster for the Jewish people, as they were killed by the Crusaders. A lot of Zionist leaders were convinced in turn of the 20th century Europe that they could never really belong as part of the European countries that were full of right-wing anti-Semitic nationalists who enjoyed romanticizing a bunch of medieval knights who killed both Jews and Muslims. So it seems a little bit strange that the Zionists would then identify with the cause of the Crusaders. But what they most identified with was the notion that Jerusalem was their holy land and that they were willing to fight to protect that land. There are certainly some even greater ironies about how the Crusades are remembered today because of the writings of those 19th century historians. We have to keep in mind that the main protagonists of the Crusades were barbarians from the edges of both the Christian and the Muslim worlds, and they did not originally identify with either religion. They belatedly embraced their faith with this excessive zeal in order to fit into the civilizations that they had only very recently conquered. And you can view this instead as a conflict between the Seljuk Turks and the Normans, and it becomes sort of a parable for this era. The Normans, who are not really claimed by any present-day nation, are essentially Vikings who settled in northern France, or called Normandy in the 10th century, and when they're there, they convert to Christianity, they learn French, and then they conquer England, Ireland, Sicily, and set off on the Crusades in the Middle East. The Seljuks, if you remember, are originally these ruthless mercenaries who seize control of Baghdad and take over the Abbasid Caliphate. They are not necessarily Muslim at the beginning, but they end up converting. So in reality, both of the instigators of the Crusades were far from pious, and they're not necessarily always remembered correctly when people discuss the Crusades. They were definitely eager to compensate for their lack of pious credentials, and that explains why they ended up as the protagonists in this epic religious war. The Norman Christians accepted Christianity nominally at first, and this was their stipulation that if they settled in northern France, they needed to become Christians. So they began to patronize churches and monasteries, and it became a crucial method of gaining acceptance as a respectable part of this new society. In the words of one abbot, the Crusaders were, quote, more apt to destroy than to build the temples of the Lord. And we know that this can be true when we look back and think about the crusade in which the Crusaders came in and actually sacked Constantinople because they were bribed by Pope Alexius III, who disliked the emperor who had been put on the throne in Constantinople. They took all the wealth they could find, they killed and raped Christians as they went, they stole the statues of horses that now adorn St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, and they retook exactly none of the Holy Land, instead hurting the greatest city in Eastern Christendom. And this didn't just happen once. There was constant fighting between the Christians of the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe. But today, we've rewritten this as a holy war, and we see it in shades of black and white. The civilized and the religious, the Christians, versus the barbaric people of the wrong faith, the Muslims. On the other hand, you have the Muslims, and they sound an awful lot like the story of the Normans. They move into the Abbasid dynasty, and they began to convert to Islam. And as they do, they take over, but they take over without any dissent at all to the Prophet Muhammad. They certainly are not elected by the Ummah or the community of believers within the Islamic world. And so they reinvent themselves as the defenders of the Sunni faith, and yet they are pretty much standing opposite of everything that either the Sunni or the Shia believe in, and this proves problematic throughout the Crusades. One envoy actually described the vices of the Turks as including, quote, the shamelessness of their women, who were always unveiled and brazenly exposing their privates, the general aversion to water and washing, and the fact that men never took off their garments, which became encrusted with dirt until they frayed away and disintegrated. So just like the Christians, there wasn't necessarily a pious kind of behavior that began these crusades, and yet this is very much how they're remembered by both sides. Absolutely, some of the crusaders who fought were hypocrites, but I think there was a large majority who were simple men that were convinced by their own religious rhetoric or that of the Pope or that of their holy leader that they were doing the right thing. And you find this on both the side of the Muslims as well as the Christians. But what has happened is historians have taken a very complex war in which you see Muslims fighting Christians and Christians fighting Jews and Christians fighting other Christians, and they've distilled it into this very simplistic narrative. And it becomes this holy war between the West on one side and the Christian forces and the East on the other side with the despotic Muslim forces. And we use it as a way to back up the way in which we see the world, to back up our own rhetoric that the West represents freedom and the East represents unfreedom. And so what you're doing this week with your discussion board is that you're going to read a couple of documents and watch a little clip or two. And on the one hand, you'll learn about the conflict in Palestine, between Palestine and Israel, and the fact that the Jews and the Muslims are still fighting over the same holy land as they were during the Crusades. You're also going to learn a little bit about Islamophobia. What kind of beliefs is it that people today have about Muslims in the United States? What kind of discrimination exists against Muslims in the United States? And it's going to hopefully put together for you, piece together this idea of why it's so easy for us to look at the Crusades as a war that was just over religion, as a holy war, and not to think about the fact that it was a war over land and territory and natural resources and wealth and power and prestige, and that it was a war that pitted Christian against Muslim and Christian against Jew and even Christian against Christian, and that this very simplistic narrative that's been written by historians is in fact false, and that it is the same as when you take a history class in the United States and you learn only good things about our founding fathers or only good things about important events in American history. It's learning about Christopher Columbus and being taught that he discovered America and that he is a wonderful conquistador instead of being taught that he was a rapist who fed Native American babies to his dogs. And so what I hope that you get from this discussion of the Crusades and of what happened between the Middle East and Western Europe and Eastern Europe is that this isn't a story of black and white. It's a story with lots of different shades of color, and that you cannot trust just one historical source. You have to get the entire picture to fully understand the event and to understand why certain groups have co-opted this event and attempted to use it to their own benefit over time. So the very last thing that I just want to quickly talk about are the gunpowder empires. And these are the empires that form when the Islamic world expands after the Crusades between the 15th and 17th centuries. And they include the Safavid Empire, which is located in Persia, the Mughal Empire, which is located in India, and the Ottoman Empire, which is located in the former Byzantine Empire. And you all will learn a little bit more about them next week when we do the Age of Exploration. But in general, these empires are formed by outside conquerors who go in and they unify these regions based on their mastery of firearms. They develop a centralized administration, which allows them to mobilize their financial power, their manpower, and their natural resources in order to purchase gunpowder, which is quite expensive, and then they can supervise the deployment of their arms and the training of their military. Gunpowder is actually first used in China in the 10th century, and it's used by the Ming Dynasty in their artillery when they fight the Mongols. Eventually, the Mongols pick up this technology, and when they go and attack the Middle East picks it up, and slowly it diffuses into Europe during the Crusades. Now, firearms and a lot of weapons made out of gunpowder were very expensive and very complex in this time period, so only the wealthiest states were going to be able to afford them. They would trade in these weapons in order to form a monopoly of centralized states, who would then use this advanced weaponry to go out and conquer all of the surrounding territory. And the Islamic world is really at the center of the trade networks and learning as a result of this. So we're going to see that there is going to be a second flowering of Islam. And one of the great impacts of the Crusades is that the learning of many of these Islamic scholars is going to spread, as well as their culture, throughout vast regions of Europe and Asia and Africa and portions of the Middle East even further. And that as we move into the age of exploration, while Western Europeans are going to focus on the New World, the Old World up until World War I is really going to be dominated by the Ottoman Empire and by these gunpowder empires.